Hi everyone, welcome to my channel. Before we dive into tonight's creepy story, don't forget to like and subscribe so you never miss a scare. Now, let's get started. It was the summer we ventured into West Glacier, Montana. This trip was part of a tradition my friends and I had kept up for years, a camping trip to a new destination, somewhere secluded, untouched by the noise of the city. This year, it was me, Aiden, and my two friends, Drew and Oliver. We'd been doing these trips for as long as I could remember, ever since college ended and we scattered in different directions for work. Drew, now a photographer with a knack for capturing nature's raw beauty, always brought along his gear, ensuring our trips were more than just memories in our heads. Oliver was the joker of the group, always able to find humor even in the tense moments, which turned out to be more valuable than ever on this trip. The first day was idyllic, exactly what we came for. We hiked some trails, fished in the cold, clear river, and explored the forest. The landscape was beautiful, lush, green, and open, giving a sense of endless freedom. That night, after a campfire and plenty of laughs, we retired to our tents. I had my own, and Drew and Oliver shared theirs, as they always did. Nothing unusual happened that night. Just the sounds of the forest, crickets, owls, and the occasional rustling in the underbrush. The second night, though, was different. We had just finished up by the fire, swapping stories until we were all yawning. The night was thick, no moon to light up the trees, and it was colder than expected. We extinguished the fire and climbed into our tents, wishing each other good night. Maybe an hour passed, and I was drifting into sleep when I heard it, a voice, faint at first, somewhere in the distance. I strained my ears, thinking maybe it was just my mind playing tricks on me, but then it grew clearer. It was a voice calling out, an old woman's voice, soft but strained, saying, "Hello? Hello?" My first thought was that someone might be lost, a hiker who had wandered off the trail and was calling for help. But as I lay there, the hairs on the back of my neck stood up, and something inside me felt wrong. There was a weird quality to the voice, a sort of unnatural echo that sent a chill through me. I peeked out through the flap of my tent and saw Oliver's flashlight flickering on in his tent, and I could hear him whispering something to Drew. They'd heard it too. The voice drew closer. I could hear it more clearly now, and something in the tone was off. It sounded like someone trying to imitate an old woman, but not quite pulling it off. The more I listened, the clearer it became that it wasn't a woman at all. There was something almost mocking in the way it called out. "Hello? Hello?" Suddenly, the voice was right outside my tent. The sound was so close I could feel the vibrations in the fabric, and I held my breath, praying it wouldn't know I was inside. Then, without warning, something hit my tent, hard, and it began shaking violently. I stifled a scream as I scrambled backward, clutching my sleeping bag. The shaking was relentless, each jolt feeling more desperate than the last, and I heard Drew yelling from his tent. "Get the hell out of here!" His voice echoed across the clearing. Just as quickly as it started, the shaking stopped. I listened, barely daring to breathe, as footsteps, heavy, purposeful, moved away from my tent and into the trees. The forest went silent again, but the air felt charged, like a storm was about to break. I crawled out of my tent and ran to Drew and Oliver's, diving inside, heart pounding. We sat there in silence for a few moments, all of us shaken. What the hell was that?" Oliver whispered, his voice barely audible. None of us had an answer, but the fear in his eyes told me he was just as terrified as I was. After a few minutes of tense silence, we decided there was no way any of us were going back to sleep alone. We agreed to stay together, in one tent, and Drew suggested taking turns keeping watch. We'd leave as soon as the sun came up, but until then, we'd do whatever we could to keep safe. Drew took the first shift, while Oliver and I tried to rest. But as my head hit the sleeping bag, the exhaustion overwhelmed me, and I slipped into a restless sleep. At some point, Oliver was supposed to take over, but I awoke to the soft gray of dawn, realizing we'd all fallen asleep. Morning brought a strange, fragile sense of safety, as if the daylight had chased away whatever horrors the night held. We packed up in silence, everyone eager to get back to the car. Once we were back in the truck and safely on the road, Drew pulled out his camera. He was scrolling through the shots from the trip, pausing here and there to show us pictures of the lake, the towering trees, our campsite in the dimming light. Then, his face went pale. He tapped a few buttons, frowning, and then turned the camera toward us. The first image was of our campsite, taken at night. None of us had gone outside to take it. The angle was slightly off, almost as if someone had crouched down and peered through the trees, photographing us from the shadows. The second image was the same, just a different angle, a little closer. It showed our tents, two shapes huddled in the dark, completely oblivious. The third image was what made my blood run cold. It was taken inside our tent. It captured us perfectly asleep, sprawled out in our sleeping bags, mouths slightly open, completely vulnerable. Drew's camera had been right next to him, and yet somehow, without any of us waking up, someone had unzipped our tent, leaned in, and snapped a picture. The realization hit me all at once, a crushing wave of dread. Someone had been there, standing over us, watching us as we slept, so close we might have felt his breath. My stomach twisted, and I could barely process the horror of it all. The idea that someone would come that close, invade that deeply, and leave without a trace, it was beyond unsettling. None of us spoke on the drive back. We didn't need to. The fear was a physical thing thick in the air. We never went back to West Glacier or any remote spot after that. In fact, camping altogether lost its appeal. The nights that followed were restless. I found myself lying awake, thinking about that voice, those footsteps, the way my tent had shook, and worst of all, the knowledge that someone had been in our tent, taking pictures of us in the dead of night. It's a memory that clings, that doesn't fade with time. We left the place unscathed physically, but there's something about that kind of fear, the kind that reminds you just how vulnerable you are. It was mid-November, and my mom was spending some time at her place near the coast, about 3 hours away. She'd been doing this more and more over the last year. It's just her and me now. My parents divorced when I was young, and I ended up staying with her. She owns a few houses, but we live primarily in the big one, a nice, secluded place at the edge of town. It's big enough that we each have our own floor. I've got the upper level, and she keeps to the main floor, which suits us both. With Mom gone, I had the place to myself, which was usually a treat. I'd stretch out, play music too loud, binge-watch horror movies into the night, little indulgences I enjoyed. I'd never been scared to stay there alone. It felt like home in every sense. But lately, there'd been these strange, unsettling occurrences. Little things, barely enough to make me suspicious but odd enough to leave me wondering. The first thing I noticed was my clothes. I'm not the tedious person, so I first thought I'd misplaced a few things. But a couple of my favorite tops, a hoodie, and even a pair of sweatpants I swore I just washed had all seemingly disappeared. I looked everywhere, and I even half-joked to myself that maybe my mom had snuck into my closet and borrowed them. But when I checked her closet, I found nothing. I checked the car, the laundry room, even the back of my dresser drawers. I dismissed it as some weird coincidence, like maybe they'd show up in some random spot. Still, it irked me. A few days later, another odd thing happened. I was watching a movie in bed one night when my bedroom door closed. It was subtle, not even a slam, just a soft click, as if someone had pushed it gently. I stared at it for a few seconds, my heart beating a bit faster. Maybe it was a draft or some other harmless reason, but I was the only one home. I got up, opened the door, and looked down the hall. Everything was silent, just the quiet hum of the house itself. After a minute, I brushed it off and returned to my movie. But the feeling lingered. It felt like I was being watched. I even went downstairs to make sure all the windows and doors were locked. I was on edge, but everything was secure. A few more days passed. I'd almost managed to forget about the clothes, the closing door, even the weird feeling, but I couldn't shake the sensation that something was wrong. Late one night, I heard a faint noise, something shifting, a quiet shuffle. I thought it might be coming from downstairs, but it was hard to tell. Still, I wasn't exactly eager to investigate alone in the dark. I reasoned it was probably nothing and forced myself back to sleep. The next night, it happened again. Louder this time. A scraping sound, almost like fabric sliding against the floor. I couldn't ignore it. I grabbed my phone, turned on the flashlight, and made my way downstairs. I checked the kitchen, the living room, the hallway, every room. Nothing seemed out of place. Then, as I was about to head back up, I noticed something odd. The basement door was open, just a crack. Now, this might not sound unusual, but that basement door is heavy, with a sturdy latch. I was sure I'd closed it. I walked over, heart thudding in my chest, and pulled the door open a bit wider. The basement stairs loomed in front of me, leading down into darkness. I reached out to flip on the light, but something stopped me. I could feel this presence. I can't explain it, but something just felt wrong. I froze, listening, straining to hear any sound. And then I caught it, the faintest noise, a quiet rustle from somewhere deeper down. My stomach twisted. I slowly closed the door, backing away and trying not to breathe too loud. Once upstairs, I called the police. I tried to keep my voice steady, telling them that I thought someone might have broken into my house and was hiding in the basement. The operator stayed on the line, and I told her I was going to wait by the front door. My hands were shaking, and I kept glancing back toward the hallway, half expecting to see someone standing there. The police arrived quickly, 2 officers. They asked me a few questions, then motioned for me to wait in the kitchen while they checked out the basement. I heard them calling out, their voices firm but calm. "Is anyone down here? Come out now!" I stood there, barely breathing, listening to the muffled sounds of footsteps moving down the stairs. They were down there for a while, longer than I expected, but finally, they called me over. One of the officers looked at me, his expression serious but calm, and asked if I had known there was a man living in my house. I felt the blood drain from my face. I shook my head, my throat tight. They led me down the stairs, explaining as we went. They'd found a man hidden behind a small, cramped storage door in the basement, the kind of space that you'd almost never notice. And there he was, sitting in the corner of this tiny, hidden compartment, his body hunched, his eyes wide and wary. The man was maybe in his 50s, bald, with a sallow, lined face that looked as though it hadn't seen the sun in years. He was wearing one of my missing sweaters, and beside him was a pile of clothes and other things I recognized: jewelry, my favorite hoodie, a couple of my mom's scarves. It turned out he'd been living in that crawl space for who knows how long, sneaking out to take food, clothes, and whatever else he could find. The worst part? There was a rank smell in that little room. He'd been using it as a bathroom too, which meant he'd been down there for days, maybe weeks. The police questioned him, and from what I gathered, he was someone who'd slipped through the cracks of the system. He admitted to watching me sometimes, through the small gaps in the walls. My skin crawled at the thought. I tried to keep a brave face, but inside, I was horrified. All those little moments I'd brushed off, the missing clothes, the door shutting on its own, they were him. They took him away that night. I thought I'd be relieved, but it was hard to shake the feeling that he was still there, hiding just out of sight. Even after they'd cleared out his makeshift room and locked up the basement, I felt his presence lingering. My mom came home the next day, and I told her everything. She was as shocked as I was, but she tried to comfort me, promising that we'd change all the locks, add security cameras, and keep every door bolted tight. We never really used the basement much after that, not without a sense of dread. And to this day, I can't look at a closed door without remembering that feeling, the quiet, creeping terror of not knowing who's watching, or where they might be hiding. I've always loved kayaking alone. There's this quiet, secluded stream not far from my house that runs through thick woods, and for years, it's been my go-to place whenever I needed a break. It's isolated enough that I'd rarely, if ever, see another soul. Just me, the water, and the trees. That's all I wanted. It was a perfect summer weekend when I decided to take my kayak out again. The weather was warm but not too hot, the sky a clear blue, and the whole world felt calm. I was eager for the quiet and the gentle sound of the water, so I loaded up my gear and drove to the stream, the anticipation making me feel almost giddy. When I pulled up to my usual parking spot, I noticed something odd. A car was already there. It threw me off a bit since I'd never seen anyone else parked there before. It was a beat-up, old gray sedan with rust eating away at the edges, and it looked out of place, almost wrong somehow. But I shrugged it off. Maybe someone else had finally discovered my hidden spot. Not the end of the world, right? After a quick check of my gear, I carried my kayak down to the water and set off. The first 20 minutes were as peaceful as I'd hoped. The only sounds were the paddles slicing through the water, the occasional bird call, and the distant rustling of leaves. I started to lose myself in that blissful rhythm. Then I noticed something, or rather someone, moving out of the corner of my eye. A man stepped out from the trees onto the bank, close to where I was paddling. He waved and smiled, and there was nothing warm or friendly about it. That smile, it was unsettling. It reminded me of how kids smile when they're caught doing something they shouldn't be, like he was hiding something just beneath the surface. I raised a hand in an awkward wave, trying to be polite. "Nice day, huh?" I called out, forcing a friendly tone. "Perfect day," he replied, his voice carrying easily across the water. Then he just stood there, staring, that weird grin fixed on his face. I could feel my skin prickle. There was no reason to feel uneasy. People go hiking in the woods all the time. But something about him just didn't sit right with me. I didn't stick around for a longer chat. After a brief nod, I continued paddling downstream, focusing on the gentle pull of the current. But the sense of ease I'd felt at the start of my trip was gone. I felt him watching me, even when I couldn't see him. And after a few minutes, I heard the unmistakable sound of a branch snapping behind me. I glanced back, heart pounding, and saw him. He was ducking behind a tree, as if he thought he could hide from me. The way he was moving, it was clear he was following me, and badly trying to make it look like he wasn't. I tried to keep calm, to pretend I hadn't noticed, but my mind was racing. Why was he following me? I had no way to call anyone, no cell signal this deep in the woods, and even if I turned around and paddled as fast as I could, it would be another 20 minutes to the parking lot. My options felt frustratingly limited. Just keep calm, I told myself. I quickened my pace, hoping I'd lose him if I put some distance between us. But every time I stole a look over my shoulder, he was still there, moving through the trees as if he was shadowing me, trying to stay hidden. I felt a chill run down my spine, and that's when a dangerous thought crept into my mind. What if he was waiting for me to stop? Or worse, to come back? After what felt like forever, I remembered something. I fished my phone out of my bag, held it up as if I had a signal, and shouted, "Hello? Yeah, I'd like to report a suspicious person. Yes, I'm calling from the stream." My voice sounded strained, even to me, but I hoped it was convincing enough. I waited, breath held, watching. His grin dropped, and he darted back into the woods, moving quickly this time. I felt a surge of relief but didn't waste any time. I turned my kayak around and paddled hard back toward the parking lot, my mind racing with escape plans. I just wanted to get to my car and get the hell out of there. When I finally reached the bank, I pulled my kayak up and glanced around, heart still pounding, expecting him to jump out at any moment. I hurried up the path to the parking lot, but as I approached, my stomach sank. There, on the ground by my car, was a scattered mess of glass. The back window of my car was shattered, shards sparkling in the sunlight. The horror of it hit me like a slap. This wasn't just some random creep trying to scare me. He'd broken into my car. And suddenly, I couldn't shake the feeling he might still be close, maybe even waiting for me to let my guard down. Panicking, I ducked into the shadows of the trees and crouched there, breathing shallowly, keeping my eyes fixed on my car. Then, finally, a flicker of signal bars appeared on my phone screen. I called 911, whispering frantically to the dispatcher, explaining everything as best as I could. She assured me that officers were on the way and told me to stay hidden. The minutes felt like hours. Every small sound, every movement in the trees felt like him coming for me. I tried to steady my breathing, but the terror wouldn't let go. Eventually, I heard the crunch of gravel as the squad car pulled up. I scrambled out from my hiding spot, waving to the officers. They approached my car carefully, glancing at the broken window, and then one of them motioned to the other. He pointed to the back seat. I couldn't see what he noticed, but then the second officer opened the door. And out of the shadows, the man stepped, crouched, with his hands over his head. He looked more like an animal caught in a trap than a person. They pulled him out, cuffing his hands behind his back. He wouldn't look at me. His head was lowered, and that terrible, unsettling grin had been replaced with a look of fear. I felt a dark satisfaction watching them shove him into the squad car, knowing he was finally caught. The officer who stayed behind told me later that he'd found a length of rope, duct tape, and a large hunting knife in my car. The man had broken in while I was out on the water and waited there, hidden in the back seat, planning to ambush me when I returned. If I hadn't noticed the broken window, if I hadn't thought to call for help, he might have succeeded. I shivered, realizing just how close I'd come to an ending far more gruesome than I wanted to think about. When I finally got home, I was exhausted, but I couldn't shake the thought that he'd been out there, lurking, planning. I haven't been back to that stream since, and I'm not sure I ever will.